recording. Great. Well, let's get started. Good to see all of you, especially for those who might tune in later. My name is Nathan Walton. I'm the pastor of formation and discipleship at Charlottesville Vineyard Church. And yeah, I'm excited about today's conversation. So just to give a little bit of backstory to some of this, this is still a fairly new series for us at Vineyard, as we've been trying to think about what it means to respond well to what's happening in our church and in our broader society. And we try to think about what does it mean to creatively respond to what's most needed, and how do we get a gauge on what questions people are asking during this time, and how we might kind of steer our own spiritual formation as a church to actually respond to those pressing questions and needs that people have. So that's kind of the idea behind this series. And we got a sense from some of the congregants about what were some questions they were asking. So as we think about mental health in particular, we definitely have felt like this has been a really important topic for the church in general, but the fact that we're in the midst of a global pandemic has only exacerbated the need to talk about this and address this and try to think creatively about how we support one another during this particular season of our life together. And so my hopes for today is that we could have an informative conversation so that we can all just, at the very least, leave a bit more equipped to understand these issues, but even more equipped to seek help if we need help, or know more ways about how to help others along the way who might be just trying to navigate all of this. Because I think this is certainly a topic that's relevant for all of us, albeit in maybe different ways, but it's something that I think we all can benefit from. And in many ways, this isn't a conversation just about right now, but it's really a long-term conversation, because mental health is always going to be something that's important for us to take seriously and to prioritize as an aspect of how we engage in our own spiritual walks with one another. So to give you a sense of the logistics for this, I'm going to be facilitating a conversation. So it's an interview kind of, but also it's a conversation. And I'll be leading that with Megan and Dana, who we'll turn it over to in a little bit. But in the background, Jim is here as well, our lead pastor, and he's handling a lot of the administrative responsibilities for today's conversation. And so he'll be looking over and managing the chat. So if you have questions, feel free to write in any of those questions that you have. I would love also if up front you could go ahead and write in just a sentence or so about what you're hoping to get out of today's conversation. If there are particular questions you're asking, or particular clarifications you would love on this topic, or maybe just things you might be wrestling with. We'd love to kind of know those. So once we shift into Q&A, we can have a kind of a heads up on what might be of most interest to you. But yeah, write questions throughout the time as well. But we love for you to initially write down in the chat what you're kind of bringing to this conversation, or what you are looking to get out of it. Other thing I should mention, although you might have a notification, is that this is being recorded. And so just putting that out there. And that way it will benefit those who couldn't make the call this afternoon. So let's jump in. I'd love to begin by just giving our two, let's say, panelists the floor for a moment, just to share a bit about your own vocational background regarding this topic, just so people kind of know like what your background is with kind of thinking through some of these issues. And also, if you could share why you got interested in that field, I think that would be helpful for us to just get to know you better before we jump in to some more questions. So just tell us a bit about your vocational background and what got you interested in this topic.
Dana, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Dana. So currently right now I am the site director of a counseling agency in Charlottesville and Harrisonburg. So I cover both sites, and we work with at-risk youth and adults with serious mental illnesses. And so at this time I oversee all of our kind of like programming and things at the site level for both sites. I have been a counselor working in the field, I guess it's been since I graduated from college in 2011. And so I've just been working in different levels, different capacities in leadership, and now I'm currently really doing a lot more leadership, but I also currently work with clients as well. So I primarily work right now with teenagers. I do have a couple of adults, but primarily I'm working with teenagers and kiddos. I got into this field after experiencing a mentoring program my last year of college, where my little sister was being bullied, and that kind of just really impacted me that last year. And I decided very last minute to go into a counseling program with one of my friends who was starting it at the same time. I had no idea what I was jumping into. I think that I had ran away from being a counselor for so long, or just wanting to do anything that remotely was similar to what my mom did in social work and all her background. So this was definitely something that I was not really thinking about up front, but kind of just kind of landed in my plate. And so, yeah.
Awesome. Well, my name is Megan Blakely. I'm trying to think of how far to go back. I think it started for me in college, wanting to do, for me, it's like the ministry and counseling together have been combined for some of the time. And then distinctly separate as well. I think what led me into the field was my own experience in counseling over years and years. After losing my mom to breast cancer when I was younger, when I got to college, I decided to deal with a lot of that grief. And that led me on a really wild but amazing journey of just a lot of healing that, like, I knew I needed about my mom, but then all this other stuff started coming up. So my experience with my therapist was pretty profound over the years. It was on and off over probably like a good 10 years, from like age 19 to 29, on and off with some gaps in there. So I had a really long, profound experience dealing with trauma and just grief and a bunch of different stuff. And then after college, I did social work for about 5 years in different capacities. I worked with at-risk youth as well. I did foster care case management in the south and west side of Chicago, and I worked with developmentally disabled adults. So I had like a variety of different settings and different people groups that I worked with. And the thing that I loved about each one of those spaces was the times that I got to go further into their stories and really like dig into their lives and their hearts and their souls, and kind of do work that wasn't so in each one of those roles I really couldn't do that because that wasn't my role. I wasn't the therapist. I was the social worker. I was mediating services, and I was going to court, and I was doing all kinds of things that were great and needed. I just found that my heart was continually drawn to, like, I really want this person to be freed from patterns of abuse and shame and all kinds of stuff. And what I needed to do in order to do that kind of work was go get a counseling degree. So about 5 years out of school, I went back around, I think Jim and I were like just married, or married to like a couple years, and I put some things on hold, and I just plowed through my program in a little under 2 years, and I got my counseling degree. And then I started working more from that time on, minus a year in home therapy, and Dana's had experience. You've done that a lot. I only had a year of that. And so other than that, I've been doing outpatient therapy. So working with teens all the way through people in their 60s with all kinds of mental health issues. So that's my story.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. That was really helpful. And we're excited to have you both on this call. So just to jump in, I think I mentioned this last week, but I think it's really important in any conversations like this to actually define our terms so that we know what we're all talking about. And so I'm curious from you all, or from you both, how would you define mental health?
Are you waiting?
I'm thinking.
Okay, I was like, I mean, I can go. I think that over the years, I think there's a big stigma around mental health. And so I see mental health as just as important as our physical health, right? Like, it's all in one. I think it's taking care of our minds and our bodies so that we can be better individuals and work at our best potential. Sometimes I don't even use sometimes the word mental health as often as just like, it's your well-being, right? It's your ability to kind of take care of you on all levels, and whatever that looks like in a holistic approach.
Yeah. I would say ditto to that. Just the whole, I'm a fan as well of just the holistic approach, and mental health being a big part of that, for sure.
Awesome. That was really helpful. I mean, I think Yeah, as I think about it too, I mean, y'all are the experts, obviously, but the language I'm hearing is holistic, right? The fact that mental health actually is maybe a broader category than we might think of it a lot of the time. And so, like, maybe pivoting to shift towards kind of the relevance of this conversation, how would you describe the relationship between Christian faith on the one side and mental health on the other? Like, how are those things related? Are they related? What does that mean?
I think they're absolutely related. I think it's really hard to have a vibrant spiritual life and be mentally or emotionally not really doing well. I think they are what's the word? Not mutually exclusive. Is that what I'm trying to say? Yeah. So I think they're very much tied together. And I think we can see that in our own lives, like when we're not doing well, and either or, like if we're not doing well spiritually, I feel like our mental health kind of suffers. And if we're not doing well in our mental health, I think our spiritual health suffers. I think they're very much intertwined.
Awesome.
Yeah. I agree. I think that they are very much intertwined, but I think they also have differences culturally too as well. I think there are cultural differences that kind of also play in that Christianity or any like faith-based in mental health as well. I think that sometimes those things impact the faith part of like incorporating that into your mental health.
Yeah, it's really helpful because, like, on one level, it sounds like we're saying they're both integrally related, but also saying that they both can impact one another, right? And something that I've been kind of thinking about is the ways that, like, I feel like there are a lot of different ways that Christians have kind of engaged things like mental health over the years. You know, I feel like on one level, there's been situations or seasons where the church seems to be under kind of spiritualizing it. So, like, they kind of acting like mental health is a separate category that we don't have to deal with, like let the professionals do that, or it's not within the purview of like Christian formation. But then there's times when I feel like the church has like over spiritualized it, where, you know, mental health is really just something to be prayed away if it's an issue, right? And so, like, there's kind of this difference of ways that people have engaged, you know, the relevance or lack of relevance of mental health for kind of Christian conversations. And so I think that's just an interesting thing to kind of think about, like, what does it mean for us to understand mental health as a part of what Christian formation is all about, right? Growing in discipleship, growing in, you know, who God has made us to be, and being whole, really. So as we think about that, what do you feel like are some of the biggest challenges to mental health?
That's a great question. Dana, thoughts?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges is the stigma around it. You know, I think that we as a society have definitely grown in terms of our ability and desire to, like, you know, be inclusive of people who are struggling with mental health, but there's still a lot of stigma around it, and there's still a lot of shame related to it and how people feel when they have been given a diagnosis or are suffering with something. And so I think that is one of the biggest challenges that I see, that then cause people to not seek mental health treatment or not seek talking to someone. And so, yeah, I really do think that's the biggest challenge in it. I think that being able to kind of recognize that you are having trouble, and then that you need more than, you know, just the friend who you can talk to, or just your pastor who you can talk to. I think that there are times when there needs to be other interventions from someone who can help guide you and support you through that time period.
Yeah, I agree. I think another challenge, if we're throwing the net wide in terms of challenges, I think for a lot of folks it's a financial challenge to actually get help. And I think if you come from a lot of money, it's probably easy to find whatever you want. And if, you know, you have and Dana, you maybe could speak to this more, but if you have Medicare, Medicaid, I'm guessing that the services, I'm not sure it's easy, but there are services available. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, there are services that are available.
Yeah. So I feel like there's that middle group of people that like aren't on either end of the spectrum, where it's like in insurance. I mean, when I first started, insurance used to cover a lot more of outpatient services. So if you don't need to be like institutionalized or don't need like an inpatient kind of thing, that's pretty much the majority of people needing more outpatient services. And I feel like insurance companies over the last decade have just like tanked in terms of like, they'll give you, you know, medicine, and medicine is needed and really helpful for the right person in the right, you know, situation. Insurance companies will cover that really well, but in terms of preventative or like the long-term healing, I think that's really hard for people to find. And it's costly. So.
Yeah. So it's not like part of what I'm hearing is on one level, there can be the stigma associated with it, right? Which in many ways can be kind of a cultural thing, whether that's broader American culture or other specific cultures where like, we kind of don't want to touch that, or we feel like that's not for us, or maybe we feel shame about having to need some help. But then what I'm also hearing is the cost of professional care, right? Yeah. Depending on the level of need that individual might have. What's something I've been thinking about too is like just like one challenge is some of the things that are more situational, right? So like someone might, you know, not necessarily be having a lot of struggles with mental health, but then COVID-19 happens, mm-hmm. right? And then like, so this situation for a moment or for a season becomes this kind of catalyst for a greater level of need. But then I think there's also just ongoing everyday things, you know, like living in poverty can create a challenge and create a greater need for, right. you know, mental health support because you're balancing so many things, or you're juggling so many jobs, so you're under so much stress and anxiety. And so like, I think it seems like there's a lot of different things that could be kind of affecting all of us in different ways to push us to really need to seek out help. And so, and Dana, you kind of mentioned this too, like just the whole point of like someone getting to a point where they have to realize, oh, I actually need to take an additional step. And that's kind of my next question. Like, what is it, how do we identify when we need to take additional steps or need to seek additional support, right? Like, how do we know if we need to do that or how we need to do that? How do we kind of self-identify what our own next steps are? And part of the background of that is I feel like for a lot of people, myself included, times I'm like, oh, I'm good. I think I'm all right. Versus actually asking myself the question like, oh, maybe this thing that I've been doing, or maybe this way I respond to the situation is a sign that, you know, there's something deeper I really need to kind of give to God and maybe share with others, or maybe I need to be more vulnerable in order to actually heal or grow. But yeah, what are your thoughts on how we identify if we need to take additional steps?
So I think there's a lot of different things that come to mind for me. And then I think about like how other people in your life can support that for you as well. Like whether that's family or friends, and encouraging those parts of it, if that's normalized, you know, like that's normalized, because sometimes it's not. Mm-hmm. But I think really paying attention, I'm really big on the idea of like mindfulness in your body telling you kind of like what you need. And so I think being able to kind of pay attention to your body and your thoughts and what you are feeling, right? Being able to take that moment and just stopping and kind of assessing like, what is it that is really kind of like getting me going? What's activating those like really negative or different thoughts that aren't part of my kind of normal daily routine, right? Like what does that look like? Or even assessing or talking to someone you feel comfortable with about like, do you see something different, or has something changed in me that like, what are you seeing? You know, like, what are you seeing? And then just wanting that desire, because I think that a big part of therapy, you can go, but if you're not ready to go to therapy, like it's not going to be helpful, right? You've got to be in a place that you're ready to like receive and seek that support. And so as much as like a family member or even a friend could like encourage that, if you're not at a place to get there, that's a really difficult place to be in, like being pushed into therapy.
Right. Yeah, I'm in agreement with Dana. All the people that I have counseled over the years that have not been wanting to be there or willing, and most of those were teenagers brought in by their parents, it didn't work because they weren't invested. Sometimes that would shift if we could develop like enough of a relationship where there was trust built, but oftentimes that wasn't the case. Another thing I think in terms of knowing, your question was knowing like when we need to take a next step, Nathan, right?
Yeah, when we need additional support or help.
Yeah. So two simple things. I feel like when you get stuck, meaning like, oh, this thing keeps happening, right? It's like the same repeated pattern in my life, and I can't seem to shake out of the pattern. It keeps happening. I keep having this cycle of thoughts, B, not being able to shirk off this one behavior. Oh, I find that I keep interacting with people the same way and I just don't like that. Or things really start coming up from your past where maybe you don't have, like, it's not the best to talk to family or friends necessarily. Like, you want somebody who's a neutral person. Like, therapy is a great option for that, or finding somebody who's not associated with that kind of a neutral person. But getting stuck or repeated patterns, I think, are a good indicator.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I think it sounds like there are a couple of different things you guys are putting on the table, right? On one level, there seems to be just the importance of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Right? So like, Danny, you'd mentioned like paying attention to your body. And to me, that means like, oh man, it doesn't actually have to be that complicated. Like, we just listen to our body. It will probably tell us a lot about how we're doing. And with Megan, what you said with that is like paying attention, being self-aware enough to know when we're actually stuck, and like being able to name what those things are. But I love that there's also a push to turn outwards, right? So Danny, you mentioned like actually asking other people, what are they seeing? I think part of what I think can be challenging about any types of mental health issues is like, it's vulnerable to open yourself up to let anybody tell you what they see. And so just being able to lean into those relationships of people that we trust, to open up ourselves up to that. I think that sounds like that can be a really good way to become more equipped to know, okay, maybe I need to seek a counselor, or maybe I need to do this or that. So kind of on that kind of note, what are other strategies that you found most helpful for mental health? Either things you've done or maybe things you've seen in some of your clients. Like, what are strategies for sustaining good mental health? Assuming that prevention is better than cure, or that this is an ongoing thing.
So I use the term toolbox a lot of times, just in different ways. But I think like having a toolbox or having tools that can or things in your back pocket that you can kind of access. So being surrounded with a healthy like friendships or partnerships, like that's really like something that can help sustain those practices. I think that for those who do use faith as a means of like supporting them and coping through, I think that can be really helpful as well. I think ultimately, like having good like sources of like coping skills, or just skills that you can use, or tools that you can use to kind of help support you or sustain the like things that you're making progress with. I think that for some, therapy can be very short term, and you can go in and kind of get out what you need to talk about and kind of move on. But for others, some of those things are like Megan mentioned, like there's like some trauma from past stuff, or you're dealing with some things that have been patterns and cycles for like years. And so I think having that sustained relationship, or having someone, even if it becomes a situation like a check-in versus like a need for like every week or something like that. So I think it really just kind of depends on like what you're actually suffering from. But I really think that connection to someone else, connection to another person, or having that group of people support system is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with Dana. I think the people that have been, for lack of a better term, the most successful in terms of like growth or healing or change have been the folks, in my experience, that have a decent enough support system, have authentic relationships, and it might only be like 2 people or something, but like that they're not isolated. I think not being isolated is huge in terms of sustained like good mental health. I think that's huge, which makes this whole situation that we're in really, really difficult. I think a lot of people, I mean, myself included, there's days where I'm like, just really feeling low. And it's just like, I wish I could go hug people. I wish I could go meet up with people in a different kind of context. And it's hard. When we're isolated, it's really hard.
So something that struck me as interesting is you all talked kind of about the ways we can cope with things that might be happening to us now. But then you also both kind of mentioned like trauma or things from the past. Mm-hmm. And I know I think there was a question in the chat that had to do kind of with the relationship between mental health and emotional health, but I kind of wonder like, how do we identify when, what we really need to deal with is what's happening right now with stress or depression or anxiety or whatever, versus recognizing, oh, this actually comes from something much deeper that has a history, right? So I think for me, I know my gut reaction is never to ask like, oh, maybe this is actually stemming from something 10 years ago, but in reality, it might be, right? So like, how do we become equipped to identify when something's actually much deeper, historically or emotionally? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think sort of like I went back to kind of my answer before of just repeated patterns. Like things keep coming up. Typically, that is a good indicator. Like if you can't shake it off, it keeps coming up. It's usually a lot deeper, right? It stems from somewhere. I have a saying that I like to say is like all roads lead back. Like all roads typically lead back to a cluster of things or events, or maybe, relational patterns, usually in childhood, could be adolescence. If we're talking about like trauma from the past, all roads do lead back to a certain kind of cluster for most people. So things tend to happen, like patterns tend to happen out of that experience or experiences or relationships from the past, and they'll keep repeating. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Dana, I don't know if you'd have anything to add.
I think that I would add, like, as a clinician, I think that as part of my kind of like getting to know someone in my intake process, like I'm asking about your history. I want to know like what's been going on before that's kind of bringing you here. But so a couple of years ago, I was able to be a part of a training for EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. And I really like that approach, and I've used it and I still use it, but I really like it because it really does make you go back. Like when you are addressing something, you have to go back and think about your earliest memory of like where that issue was happening, and then keep going back up until you get to like, current. And then the point of EMDR is to really kind of target that memory that was the first time it happened, to kind of resolve it so that you can then resolve other parts of your life. And so I think that it's really important to have someone that you're working with that really is wanting to know and support you, and wanting to know and bringing you to a place of like, therapy is supportive, but if your therapist is also not challenging you to move forward, then I think that that's not a healthy place to be in therapy, right? If you're not being pushed to kind of address some of those bigger issues, or like not saying like, hey, I noticed that, when you say this, it kind of reminded me of that time when you told me about, when you were a little girl and that thing happened to you, or, like whatever that looks like. But I think it's really important to kind of identify that relationship with a therapist is so important, even just for outcomes of therapy, but really making sure you have a therapist who is competent and actually pushing you to where you need to be, right? Is equally as important.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. Something that I've been thinking about is like, actually after I took I went through the emotionally healthy spirituality content a couple of years ago, I started to kind of notice things in myself that helped me to identify, things in my history or things in my past, and like get it over to Jesus. But what it also helped me to do was to actually recognize certain patterns in other people. Not so I could like judge them, but just to recognize, oh, maybe I should give them grace because something else is leading them to do that, right? And so kind of what I'm wondering is, as we kind of grow in our own understanding of mental health and, how we can take our own personal next steps, what can help us to actually help other people, right? Whether that's people in our families, whether that's helping our kids, whether that's helping people in our friend circles, like what can equip us to actually be agents who can promote mental health in our own communities?
My immediate answer to that is like, you can only give away as much as you've done. Like in terms of like you doing your own work, exploring, you getting healthy in whatever context that might mean, so that you can give it away. And even if you've done just like a little bit of your own work, it's like, you can give that away. You can be like, hey, I discovered this thing, and I discovered like, our EHS like has some great material. Even just going through that, 8-week course or whatever, it's like, you can immediately start to give that away by sharing your experience and sharing how you've grown. So you doing your own work, I think, is like one of the biggest indicators of like what you can give away. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it goes along the lines of like not pouring from it into you. Like you can't pour with so much of what you have to one person. I think that what gets challenging and what gets difficult is when you continue to watch someone struggling with something and they're not like, even with your support or your kind of like little tips or things that you're giving them, they're still kind of declining, right? Like I think about that in relation to a lot of kind of substance use. Right, that's a huge one that I've seen and see with family members and parents, especially with some of the population I've worked in and the histories of the clients. Is that like those are hard times where like a lot of times like people's families walk away from them, right? It's very easy to just be like, I just can't, like you, like this is obviously causing strain on our relationship, on our family, on, you know, whatever that looks like. And so it's really easy for us as family and friends to kind of walk away or turn a blind eye or be like, oh gosh, it's just so-and-so, they're just doing that again. And so I think as much as it's quick for us to do that, I think it's also important just to kind of be present and kind of recognize your boundaries related to that too, right? And so you can still set boundaries and have a relationship with someone. You don't have to support everything that they're doing. You don't have to agree with all the things that they're doing, but I think that you can have to set that boundary for yourself with that person.
Yeah, that's great. I think, yeah, boundaries are huge across the board in terms of mental health as we keep talking. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So I have more questions, but I want to make sure that I give a chance for other folks to kind of voice their own. So Jim has been kind of curating the chat. So I'm going to kick it to him to see if there are any questions that have come to the surface or themes that have been repeated.
Yeah, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Great. So a couple of questions were around the idea of prioritizing, whether it's prioritizing my time. Often this seems to have to do with like prioritizing time with family and God and things that are really important to me, yet feeling like we're really busy or that those things often get pushed out. So the question theme, if you will, seems to be about, how do I in a, I guess, a healthy way, prioritize my time so that the things that are most important to me, most valuable to me, are actually getting the high priority.
Great question. Great question. I need to answer that. I need the answer to that, not that I don't need to answer that. But
I think it is a good question. It makes me think about kind of just like with everything going on right now, and we're like in our homes, and so our homes become our work. It becomes our, you know, place of just self-care. It becomes like like you get everything that you have to deal with in your one place, right? And home may have been at some point kind of your escape, right, from work. If work is going crazy and you get to come home and then, oh yeah, it's great, but now your office is right next door to your bedroom. And so it gets things all muddled, right? It gets muddled. And so I think really trying to find spaces and time and awareness, like I go back to like the idea of like your awareness of like what you need. Even as a clinician, this time has been challenging for me with like, I have been giving so much of myself to other people and supporting their needs right now that I also have to be aware of like, hey, I'm also a person too, and I need to recognize when I need to just say no, right? That I need to just take that time for myself to just schedule in that time for me not to do it, whether it's me spending 20 minutes, which doesn't seem like a lot, of just like me time, right? Like whatever that looks like. But I think really being able to kind of recognize and identify what are those things that are important to you and what part of that do you want to get back to, and how can you make steps towards moving towards that way, especially in a time when we're so contained and isolated as is. And then we also have all of our lives happening in one place and space.
Yeah, that's well said.
I love that you mentioned kind of the ways that for many of us, home had been the escape. Because I definitely feel that way. And I feel like with all that's happened now, it's kind of like before the outside was the busy place and the home was escape. Now it's like reverse for me, where I got to get outside, and that's when I feel like I can breathe and I can like clear my mind. And so it's I think what I've learned is that like having that space to get away, even if it's getting outside instead of coming home, like even just having that kind of spatial break helps me to like reflect on what's happening a lot more clearly. which can then help me to prioritize what needs to happen or things that need to be done because I have a space to breathe. And so I guess I'll just say that's what I found helpful, like just getting outside, because then I'm not like physically seeing all the tasks and trying to figure out what I need to do and going crazy. But rather I'm like hopefully taking a nice walk, maybe with a screaming kid, but I'm outside at least. And then I can re-engage with a clearer mind usually.
Yeah. I want to add one thing, and this won't apply to everybody, but I think for some of us, taking care of ourselves is maybe something we were taught that wasn't really good, like that we should always be pouring out or giving or whatever. And maybe that's not exactly like where you fit, but like if you have a hard time taking care of yourself or like recognizing your needs and trying to meet them in some ways, like what is that about, like going to that place with yourself of like, why do I have a hard time, and kind of starting there, like what is it that keeps me from that makes me nervous about doing that? Like for some people it's like, well, what am I going to find when I slow down and meet with God and just stop being busy? Like maybe there's something there. So I think asking that question, that might not apply with everybody, but I think it applies with a lot of people that I've run across.
Awesome. Jen, do we have any others?
Yeah, I have a question really related to that, and it's about the inner dialogue or the self-critique that we can often engage in. There are a few people who are asking about that. Like, how do we develop or nurture a healthy inner dialogue with ourselves? You know, a few people mentioned that they are feeling anxious and they're kind of telling themselves anxious thoughts or kind of ruminating on those anxious thoughts, or maybe critical of self. Maybe they fail to prioritize some of the things that they want to prioritize, and they get into a guilt shame cycle. How do you deal with some of that inner dialogue or that inner critique that we often engage in?
It's a great question.
It's a great question.
So I think that it is a good question, and it makes me think about too how often we tell ourselves certain things to kind of get through certain things, right? It becomes a kind of our innate coping strategy, right? It's not very healthy, but it becomes how we have just processed and dealt with things over time. And so I definitely believe that, and I've definitely seen this with clients, is like you have to start like, yes, right now is a time where things are extremely crazy and just stressful and busy, but it's also a time to start developing healthy patterns or healthy coping skills or healthy things that you want to engage in your life too, right? Because I think the practice or the act of doing something for yourself or the act of adding that to your daily becomes something where like you won't have to always go back to those, oh, just taking care of myself is so bad, I shouldn't take care of myself. When if it's something that you're doing habitually every day, it becomes just a part of second nature. You're not questioning yourself about taking care of yourself. So I think you really have to develop the skills to really start practicing the things that you want to put into place. Because when all this is said and done, you have to be able to go back into it and still continue to do that and not just give it up just because COVID's over and you get to go out and just like run around and do whatever, right? You need to still go back and be able to like practice those skills. It's similar like with counseling, right? You see people who come in and you work with them, they get some tools, they're doing better, and then they're like, oh, I'm great. I don't have to do any of this anymore. Like I'm good, right? It's all good. Things are wonderful. I can stop coming to counseling. Like they drop off and you're like, okay, I'll probably see that person back here in a few months, because they've just given up all those things because they think it's momentarily, right? Like they think that in the moment, once you get that quick, like not quick high or that quick, like things are great, that happiness all back over. And then soon that's just going to come with another moment of a low. And so I think it's really important to start like incorporating things in your life that you want to be practices beyond this time frame.
And I think along with the practices, I think that's really great, because we need those to like sustain and to have goals, right? And like I'm assuming, Dana, that's sort of like the toolbox thing, right? It's like those are in the toolbox. Mm-hmm. And I think something alongside of that where faith really comes in, where like our relationship with Jesus comes in is for me in my experiences with myself and then other people, really what's typically at the bottom of negative self-talk that's more pervasive, where there's the like guilt shame cycle is a lie or multiple lies or a cluster of lies that we have believed. And I think identifying what those lies are and doing some like for real kind of like renouncing and even repenting if that's necessary can really shake that loose and really free somebody in a significant way. And I've seen it over and over again. So I think we have to address like what's at the bottom of the critical thinking or of the critiquing and the critical self-talk and of that shame. And I think often, and most often, it really goes down to like a lie that we believe.
I think it's good. And something that I've that I found helpful too is in certain seasons of my life, like writing down things, right? So like I'm thinking in a moment where I might identify a lie, like maybe I need to write down the truth. And maybe that's part of my journaling exercise or like somewhere to remind myself of what I need to replace that lie with.
Yep.
And that could be one practice that people employ as well.
Yep.
Anything else, Jim?
Yeah, kind of a middle point shifting to more of an outward focus, but not entirely. So this is about when we're caring for others, we have others in our lives who are struggling with some sort of mental health issue. It doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown disorder. Maybe they're struggling with anxiety, or maybe they're struggling with addiction or something like that. How do we as caregivers, I think maybe the question is, how do we help in a healthy way differentiate ourselves so that what happens in their lives with their behavior and their decisions doesn't dictate how we feel or the kind of we're having, that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm gonna leave that to the professionals.
Yeah. I think it really goes back to what I said earlier about that boundary, right? Being able to have your boundaries with that person and in that situation, and being able to walk away. Like there is, I think it's important, and I think, it's important to kind of walk away from a situation that's not filling you up either, right? Like you can't continue to like experience that and then that's draining your own well-being, like helping and supporting someone. And so you can't cause someone to change. You can't make them change. Like they have to want to change for themselves. And I say that, I think I say that so much just in practice in like my outpatient setting, because a lot of times clients come in and saying like, well, so-and-so keeps telling me that I need to do this, or so-and-so keeps like saying I need to do this, but I'm like, but what do you want to do, right? Like what a part of that do you want to do? Like what do you want to acknowledge? Like where is it that you want to go with this? And so as a person taking care of someone else, I think it's important to kind of at some point, it's about just putting up your stop sign, right? Just saying like, hey, like I care enough about you and I care enough about myself that I have to put my own boundaries on, right? I have to put my own shades on to kind of not allow you to kind of overcome me with what's going on with you. And sometimes it's not really easy, right? You can't always just do that, especially when it may be a child or a really good friend and you have that relationship and you love that person and you know that you can see the good in them and the better parts of them. But you have to be able to, for your own mental health and sanity, is to be able to take care of you. Like you can only do but so much or give so much of yourself, as Megan kind of mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think boundaries are huge here. And I think, like Jana said, like if it's your kid, you can't really just walk away. Or if it's like your like a significant family member or somebody who's like really in your life, I think walking away isn't always an option. Sometimes it's necessary, like if there's significant abuse. Absolutely. I think that's a whole different, I think certain things make that a very different scenario very quickly. So I want to be cautious about that in terms of like abuse and stuff. But I think like sort of along the lines of like codependency, right? Like, which is like in super simple terms, it's like not knowing where I stop and somebody else begins, right? There's just sort of this blend into another person emotionally. And when they have a good day, we have a good day. When they don't have a good day, like we don't, and our life is kind of on their roller coaster. That's kind of a easy term for codependency. And I think trying to be well, like Jim said, well differentiated. So like walking next to somebody as opposed to carrying them, right? Like you can support somebody being next to somebody, having good boundaries. Like Dana said, just your presence is huge, right? Again, when it's not an abusive situation necessarily, and when you're self-differentiated, being present with somebody in their pain, in their cycles or whatever can be super helpful. And especially, and Dana, you probably can speak to more of this in terms of like addiction, when it just around and around and around it goes. Maybe you can mention more like, how do you stay present and differentiated maybe in some more severe cases?
Yeah, I think that's where not that I differ from you, Megan, but I really think that being able to know your boundaries enough to walk away from situations, because those can be really, a lot of times when I see addiction or a lot of those things, it's family members that it does turn into like abusive situations, or it turns into like emotional abuse. Like that's something too. It doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be sexual. Like it can be emotional abuse. And so your ability to kind of navigate that and know where your boundaries lie are really important. Addictions are, I mean, those are so tough to like navigate. And that can be from various things, right? You can be addicted to a lot of different things. And so being able to kind of really know your boundaries and know where you stand and know where you're like, what's your values in that, and where do you want to be? And you can tell a person like, I love you and I care enough for you that I have to do this for me, right? I have to take care of me in this situation. I have to set this boundary with you, and still walk alongside them. Right.
Yeah, I was gonna add to that, because I think like for me, a part of like knowing our own boundaries and not allowing ourselves to kind of get sucked in an unhealthy way can also be about how much do we trust God, right? Like, and what I mean by that is, I know there've been certain situations in my life where like I've kind of assumed kind of a savior mentality of, oh, this person brought me a problem, so like I've got to fix it. If I don't fix it, then I'm not doing my job. I'm not being a good pastor, or and too easy I can slip into trying to be something that I'm actually never called to be, and that's a savior. And so I think instead I felt God kind of pushed me to say like, hey, do I actually trust God enough to like do what I can and steward that relationship to the degree that I should, but also recognize that like I need to hand this to God at some point, you know? And to me, that's kind of like a tension that I often feel. Like, how do you recognize like what our own responsibility is and the extent of that, but then how do you recognize the fact that we don't want to overstep that, because that's not good for them if we're not healthy and we're burnt out and we're like frazzled, but it's also not helpful. But it's not helpful for us, and it's not helpful for them. That's kind of some of the stuff that I've been kind of wrestling with too. But anything else, Jim?
Yeah, sure. So this one makes the full transition into caring for others, but the question is out there in a couple different forms about how we care for others who, especially in this season right now, are experiencing a high degree of anxiety or fear. What does it look like? Are there practical ways that we can walk alongside and support and care for people who are really struggling right now?
Yeah, I think I've thought a lot about this, and I think again it depends on what they're struggling with, how severe, what's going on. We can't be present like physically with each other like we have been able to. So yeah, I think even, you know, like an encouraging text, or, you know, trying to meet up over Zoom for a short amount of time if you're all zoomed out or whatever. Sending, like the other week, somebody dropped something off on our front porch, and I was just like, it was one of those days where I was just feeling like super low, and I was like, oh, like somebody brought bread or whatever. And it just was like, that was so sweet and thoughtful. Even something simple like that, caring for each other, can be really helpful. If it's a more serious issue, I mean, therapists are all online, and you can still get help even in the pandemic. It's not all stopped. And I mean, my job has kept going. Dana's job has kept going. I mean, therapists are like continuing to do what we do. So encouraging somebody to still get help if they need it, if it's needing something like therapy.
Yeah, I definitely think that like there's lots of virtual options. My agency just launched something last week where we're doing coaching sessions. We're allowing 3 free sessions for people, 30 minutes just across the state to support people during this time. So like there's lots of help and support if someone needs additional help. But I think I agree with Megan, like just practical ways, and like maybe it's not calling to check in on whether or not they're experiencing a heightened level of anxiety. Maybe it's just like, hey, let's just chat about, something, a movie we watched recently. Like don't make it about the issue at hand, really just being able to be present in a different type of way for them.
That's great. That's great. To me, it kind of reminded me of like it's really hard to care for or about something that you don't know, right? So like if we're not in a relationship, then we can't know what we need to even be doing to help someone, right? So to me, it's kind of a reminder of that too, like just the importance of staying connected so that we can then identify like, oh, do we need to encourage them to use those free counseling sessions, or do we need to follow up with them about, that particular thing they're struggling with or whatever? Like, I think just having those lines of communication can give us a lot of direction around like what actual support we could offer or connect them to. But yeah, so we've got 4 minutes left. So time is wrapping up. I did want to kind of ask a question around like, what role the church can play in a lot of this? Like for both of you, like what do you see the church's role being in kind of helping to promote mental health in our communities, like whether that's right now during COVID or whether that's longer term? Are there any ways that the church is uniquely gifted or situated to do that type of work, or what needs to happen for the church to be able to do it more effectively? What are your thoughts what are your thoughts on the church's role in fostering and promoting mental health in our communities?
I personally think the church is in a great position to do just that. I think there's probably so many more ways we haven't even thought of about how we can support mental health in terms of like our church communities. But some of the things that we've been doing that I think have worked well are like the emotionally healthy spirituality class, which talks about emotional mental health with spiritual health and that combined. I think adding it in sermon series along the years. I think the prayer ministry that we do in the back almost always goes down to something, we're holistic people. So mental health stuff comes up in those prayer times often, and just addressing that with the Holy Spirit, right? Allowing him to like lead us there as well together as we pray. I think there's so many, I think we've run other courses. I can't remember the names right now, but just thinking of creative ways where we can, and house groups are great ways. It's like, you're going to know if somebody, like if you know somebody like, and they show up kind of like down or whatever, it's a great time to ask them what's going on. And usually, their face a little bit better than other people's face. So like, hey, why are you down today or whatever? Checking in, doing community in small groups, I think is a great way to support our mental health.
Yeah. I think just continuing to kind of normalize, like to bring this to the surface, right? Not to say that it doesn't exist. I think, at Vineyard, there are lots of practices to kind of incorporate mental health, but I think the bigger church, right, ideas of ways to do is really allowing that to be a conversation that happens in church, right? Like to address it, to talk about it in sermons, to kind of really allow people to know that it's not just this taboo thing that certain select people can receive or get help with if they need it.
That's really helpful. I feel like I'm hearing kind of like the church being able to move in this direction on a number of different levels, right? There's like the level of rhetoric in terms of, in our preaching or in the language that we use or like in our conversations, how much are we normalizing this topic? But then I'm also hearing, questions about structure and practices, right? Whether that's emotionally healthy spirituality in that course, whether it's prayer ministry, whether that's our micro groups or our small groups later as the fall kicks off later. So like all these different structures kind of help to provide a comprehensive way of thinking about making this a normal conversation and making this a normal part of our conception of just our spiritual lives together. So we are out of time, but I'll just mention, like, in terms of something that has stuck with me in this conversation, one of them has been just kind of the push to normalize this, right, as much as we can, because it actually is normal, and all of us are dealing with this in some way or another, or navigating this. but also remembering that mental health and this topic is not a momentary thing exclusive to a global pandemic. This is actually a part of our daily lives together. And so taking that seriously and trying to think about, what that looks like to steward that well. And also another step that I'm thinking about is like going back to something that I think it was Dana who mentioned the coping mechanisms, but like just being able to be self-reflective and identify what are my coping mechanisms, right? Like what are the things that I either are like healthy practices that I engage in, whether that's taking a walk, whether that's talking to a friend, whether that's talking to a counselor, or maybe other unhealthy practices. Because I think the more that we can grow in that self-awareness, the better equipped we'll be to actually take the next steps in pursuing mental health together. So we're out of time, but I want to say thank you to all of you who participated. Those are our panelists, obviously. Want to give a quick reminder about mental health check-ins. So if you would like to check in with Megan, she's available. Something that I've been seeing in a lot of like other churches is they're thinking about like what are structures and changes to make to steward kind of the mental health operation as well. Like one of those things is having a person on staff who's trained in some of these things. And so we're fortunate enough to have Megan. And so I encourage you to take advantage of that and to reach out and reach out to friends, people that you trust, just to make sure that you're not, if you are dealing with something or navigating something, we just don't want you to do that alone because that doesn't have to be the case. And so, just wanted to thank all of you, and I hope that you all have a good rest.
Hey, can I say one last thing real quick? Sorry. I know you're like on your closing sentence. I just wanted to circle back around to just say that like Dana, I totally am on the same page with you in terms of abuse. And I just didn't want to be unclear about that. Like if you are finding yourself in a situation like that, or you know somebody that is like sticking in it isn't healthy. If it is abuse emotionally, mentally, physically, any kind. So I just wanted to come back around and say that I'm very much in agreement. So anyway.
And I'll say too, just to kind of add, I'm not as available as Megan for check-ins, to be honest, right now. In my season, my boundaries are there.
There's your boundary.
But I have access to a lot of resources. Like I get lots of stuff sent to me. I'm giving resources to my staff. And so there's lots of stuff that if there's a question about something specific or a specific topic, I probably have something, or even community-based. Like I'm a part of a lot of groups. And so I get emails constantly about resources and help and support groups and things that are going on. So feel free to reach out to me in that way. Like I'm happy to try to get you connected if I can.
That's great.
Awesome. And all this is a reminder that like this is an ongoing conversation. And actually reminded me another thing that we'll be doing is we'll be launching a Slack channel. Some of you might know what Slack is, some might not. I was new to Slack, but it'll be an online platform for us to continue the conversation of all the topics really during this video series. And so we'll actually post this video there, and it'll be an opportunity for you to ask other follow-up questions or a chance for us to share resources as we continue to move forward. So thank you again for your time. Pray that you have a blessed afternoon.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Good to see you all.
Thank y'all. Bye.
Bye, Jed.